Hey everyone, in this video we're going to be looking at an introduction to RStudio Workbench and R Markdown. So specifically we're going to be looking at how we can knit or compile R Markdown formats to different formats, HTML, PDF, or Microsoft Word documents. We'll look at the fundamental syntax for Markdown documents, which we use in R Markdown for written explanations and giving context in a report. We'll look at how we can use code chunks in our Markdown documents to embed and interweave our code with written responses and explanations in a report. We'll look at how we can have chunk options to show or hide our codes in parts of our reports, or other options we can control like that about our R Markdown documents. And lastly, we'll look at how we can include visualizations and summary tables in our Markdown reports. So to start, we will open up RStudio Workbench, which we can do by clicking on this link, or we can always go to rstudio.gvsu.edu. We sign in with our typical GVSU credentials that we use to sign into Blackboard or email. Okay. And then once we're signed in here, this is RStudio, which we're accessing via RStudio Workbench. So RStudio is the graphical user interface, or GUI, in which we code in the programming language R. So there's R, which is the programming language itself. So like this is R code that I'm going to type in the console down here. I can calculate the mean of the numbers 1 through 5. That's the same as the mean of like this. This is R code that I submitted and compiled in the console of RStudio, where RStudio is this whole interface in which we're allowed to code in R. Okay. So the console is a spot for submitting small little calculations of R code to try out. We can also calculate the number of characters in a string, for example, using the nchar function. So we can see there was 14 characters here. So the console is one pane or sub-window of RStudio that is useful if you want to try out things or install packages. You often do this in the console area. When we want to open up a new R Markdown document, we go File, New File, R Markdown. And in this case, we will be opening up a new file and knitting to Word format. Let's try that out. Okay. You can use the other types of formats as well. It's mostly a personal choice, although there's pros and cons to each. So knitting to HTML to produce a report often has the least issues in terms of errors. Sometimes some functions don't like being knit to PDF. Some R code doesn't like it, or Word. So HTML tends to display everything correctly, has the least issues, but it doesn't necessarily look the nicest, and you cannot edit it after you compile the report. Whereas if you create a Word document for your report, that is allowed to be edited after the fact. So you could tweak things slightly to further refine your report once you've generated it. PDF output is not, you cannot edit it like a Word document, but some people like the style of PDF reports because it resembles LaTeX, which is a software used in the mathematics community primarily. So some people really like that style of type of reports when knitting to PDF because of that. So we'll be sticking primarily to Word and HTML documents here. Okay. So we opened up a new R Markdown to Word document. And RStudio by default has this blanket or template R Markdown document. So we can compile this report, or it's called knitting it, in RStudio by pressing this knit button. Okay, and then it wants a name for it. So we're going to call this my activity. Let's just call it that. So my activity. After it finishes rendering or compiling the document, it says we can download it. So it downloads our Word document, and then we can click on it to open it. Okay. Once that is open, okay, let me switch the view here. Okay, so once this is open, you can see the document here. All right. And okay, there we go. We can see the Word document here. This is what our Markdown created when we knitted to Word. All right. If we look back at the RStudio session, there we go. Okay, we can come back to our Markdown document here, and we will talk about all the different parts of this as we work through this activity. So we already did this first step here, where we created a new R Markdown document, and we knitted it by clicking the knit button. Note that we can also use the keyboard shortcuts to knit the document as well. Let's try knitting to all three different formats, HTML, PDF, and Word, and see how these differ. So we already knitted to Word. Let's try to knit to, so if we click this arrow, we can knit to HTML. And here you can see the HTML document that was produced. It contains the same information and visualizations that the Word document report did, but it's formatted slightly differently. And this is no longer something we can edit. It's a static document. Okay, so that's HTML format. PDF format, which you may need to run tinytech : install _ tinytech in the console here first. You may need to install this in order to knit to PDF. Okay. That can take some time. Okay. So that installs tinytech underneath, which allows us to knit to PDF. If that doesn't work, you can still just knit to Microsoft Word or HTML, and that works just fine. Okay. After doing that, we should be able to knit to PDF. Okay. All right, and if you can see the PDF document that was produced over here, so you can click on it, and then it opens up in your browser like that. And so again, you can see The same information is contained in the report, but it's in a slightly different format. Okay. So the outputs all have the same types of plots, but the styles are slightly different. Okay. So we'll focus on knitting to HTML format. So let's click on the arrow here and knit to HTML. So this is what we're going to be focusing on in this activity. All right. So first thing we're going to do is make sure that we have some packages that we'll need for this activity. So let's copy this code and submit it in the console part of RStudio. So we're going to paste the code here exactly as it was in the activity, hit enter. And that may take some time for you to install these packages, particularly the tidyverse package takes quite a bit of time, potentially several minutes or longer. So you may have to pause the video here and be patient while that installs for you. I'm going to click this broom icon to get rid of this output here. Okay. So that should have installed and then loaded these two packages, the tidyverse package and the flex table package, which we will need for this activity. So talking about R and RStudio in general, the R programming language is built in such a way that when you first open up RStudio, it comes with the bare minimum functionality that you need to work in R. So some other programming languages like SAS come pre-bundled with many, many different models and things you can do right out of the box. And it's very large, the installation file for that, because of that. R comes in a much more compact format and utilizes this framework in which you download what are called packages or collections of R code that other people wrote with functions, sets of R code that we can then use. And you install these packages or collections of R code as you desire to use them. So you sort of tack on and build up your own sort of customized R session, R universe that you're working in to keep things smaller so you don't need to install as much initially. Okay. So the tidyverse package gets a lot done for us here and will this semester. The flex table package will as well. Okay. So moving on from talking about packages here, our Markdown, which we'll talk about the Markdown syntax a bit here, is a report generating tool for combining explanations with data analyses in R. You can sort of think of it as like a blend between raw programming in R and typing up your responses in a Microsoft Word document and explanations. Okay. It allows you to do both things simultaneously, code and give explanations for the results and what you're doing. This is helpful for several different reasons. It allows you to be more transparent about your analyses in terms of being more clear about what you're doing and what your code is doing, but it also allows you to have more reproducible analyses. In other words, it's easier for your future self or others to come back and reproduce that same exact analysis with the same results in an efficient way. So part of the R Markdown document is what we call Markdown syntax. We sort of have two main components to the R Markdown document. The Markdown part, which is this, which is similar to Microsoft Word, where you just type sentences or explanations. And then you have R code, which is enclosed in what are called chunks. These code chunks are blocks of R code. So here it's saying we have R code, and this chunk is named cars. And this is calculating a summary for the cars data set in R. Okay, so we can click this green arrow and get this summary. Okay. Markdown, the part outside of the code chunks, if we knit, we can see, for example, here we have R Markdown, and then we have these sentences and a hyperlink. Okay, if we knit that, we can see that the word or the heading R Markdown here shows up. And that's precisely because we had 2 pound signs and a space. That says, make this a second level heading in Markdown syntax. Okay, so that's how this was made here. You can also make first level headings with just using a single pound sign, or third level headings and so on by using additional pound signs. So let's include first, second, and third level headers in our R Markdown document and call them sections 1 through 3. So let's get rid of, we have this, it's called the setup chunk. Let's get rid of everything below that, below the setup chunk here. And then we're going to paste this directions from the Word document here, from the first blue arrow. So how activities are going to work this semester is we'll have these activities we work through together, and each blue arrow that you hit, we'll read through the whole activity, but the blue arrows signify, hey, we need to actually do something here, not just think about the responses. Okay. So for this blue arrow, we need to create some headers. So to create a first level header called section 1, we'll do this, section 1. Okay. And then maybe we'll type some just filler things in the first section. So here is the first section of my report. I can't wait to tell everyone. Okay, something like that. And notice you can collapse it or open it up with this little triangle over here, which is kind of nice. We'll want to make sure we save by clicking the Save button periodically. Note that RStudio Workbench does not auto-save like a Google Docs, okay, like Google Docs does. All right, we'll create a second level header by saying section 2, or it's actually kind of like subsection 1, if we wanted to be honest. Okay, and so here we can say, here is the first subsection in our report. Then we can add section 3. Here is the first subsection. Okay. And we can knit this document to see how it looks. So let's compile it. All right. And so here you can see when knitting to HTML format, the section headers progressively get smaller in the hierarchy. Okay, but the text in between stays the same size. So we've not used any R code yet. We're just producing this blank HTML document. There's really no benefit yet to doing this above using, say, a Microsoft Word. If all you were doing was typing things out with headers and a title, author field, you should definitely just use Microsoft Word. There is no benefit to doing it yet. The benefit of R Markdown is that we can interweave R code into here eventually as well with the code chunks. Okay. But next we'll continue looking at more things we can do with the Markdown syntax besides just headers. So we can also include hyperlinks in the document. So similar to how you can include hyperlinks in a Word document using this syntax. So we can enclose a URL in this less than and greater than sign. We can link a phrase by putting it in square brackets followed by an open and close parenthesis like this. And we can also include paths to images. We can include images directly in our document using this syntax. So first, let's just, for example, include a hyperlink to the Google homepage. Okay. So we'll say, like, for those interested, Google is a great resource. Okay. So if we knit this document, there's nothing hyperlinked yet. You can't click on this and have it take you anywhere, but we'll fix that. So to hyperlink, we'll put it around enclosed in square brackets and then do an open and close parenthesis. And you can see RStudio already turned it blue to say, hey, that's a hyperlink. And then we will put the address to Google's website in the parentheses. Okay. And now if we knit this document, we can see that there is it's blue, and you can hover over it and click on this link now. Okay. And that takes you to the Google homepage because that's what we linked to. So again, no benefit of using our Markdown here above Microsoft Word or something similar like that, like Google Docs. You know, for typing things up and having hyperlinks in it is all. This is just useful because we can use our code interwoven in here in our document. So other things we can do is basic text formatting using this Markdown syntax. So we can italicize, bold, include superscripts and subscripts as well. So let's, that shouldn't be there. Let's include an italicized word or phrase, bolded word or phrase, and all these different types of things here. Okay, so we're going to work through these one by one. All right, so let's start with, and we'll number these. Okay. So to include a bolded word or phrase, we'll say like, I really like coding in R. So I enclosed a single word in asterisks, and that makes it italicized. Okay, so if we knit this, we'll see how that looks. And you can see here, it's a little bit hard to tell, but this is italicized. I really like coding in R. Okay. To get a bolded word or phrase, we can use two asterisks on each side of the word. Okay. And if we knit that, instead of italicizing it, it bolds the word. So I really like coding in R. And then to get a word styled in like code format, it's called, we can say something like, this is an R object. So around the word object, we'll put what's called backticks. To use this symbol or to get this symbol, you can look on your keyboard, and just to the left of the 1, above the Q, and to the left of the 1 on your keyboard, you should see a squiggle and a backtick symbol. If you just press it without shift, it gives you the backtick symbol. Okay. And now if we knit this, we'll see what this looks like. So in the output, it kind of highlights that word a little bit differently. It's got this grayish background, and the font is actually a little bit different. That's typically what people do to signify objects or things they created in the R program that they want to refer to, like my table or my model that you fit. You know, they would use this to signify that it's an R object that we're referring to. We can also include superscripts in R. Okay. And so we can do that by, let's see. We can use superscripts by, this is a superscript. It's actually not the tildes. This is the tilde symbol for the superscript. We want to do the caret symbols, which is on the keyboard that's located. If you look at the number 6, you can go shift the number 6. Okay. So that can give us a superscript. Let's look with that. Let's knit this and see what that looks like. Okay. We can see the superscript is like an exponent, and then we can do a subscript as well. So the subscript we can do using the tilde symbol. So if we go shift the key just to the left of the number 1, where we got the backticks from, okay, we can knit the document now and see what that looks like. And there we have a subscript. Okay. So that's how we can include superscripts and subscripts in R Markdown. So you should see in the activity, there's this table, which is included in the text formatting section that shows how to do these things. So we did this bullet here. Okay, now talking about code chunks. So again, we haven't done any actually programming in R yet. This has all been using what's called the Markdown language, which is ways we can format text responses or explanations in our report. So to use R code in our document, we can include code chunks. So here, we'll look at 3 different ways you can do that. You can use the keyboard shortcut by doing Control-Alt-I or Command-Alt-I, depending on if you're using a Windows or Mac machine. Or you can use the Insert Chunk button or manually type it out in this way. So we're going to use either the shortcut or the Insert New Chunk button. Okay, so let's at the bottom of our document click this Insert New Chunk button. And actually, in R Markdown, you can combine multiple programming languages when producing an analysis report. You can use SQL, RCPP, which is like a blend of C++ and R, Python, D3, or Bash scripts. You can have these included and executable in your document, which is really helpful because sometimes workflows might need to incorporate both a SQL query at the top and then an analysis of the data using R or Python, for example. Okay. We're always going to be using R chunks of code in this class, so we'll do Insert New Chunk R. Okay. And it has this R to signify that, hey, this code chunk is going to contain R programming. All right. So let's, include a new chunk that way. And we'll name the chunk Uptown chunk. So we can do that by adding a comma and then pasting it like this. Make sure to save. You can have multiple chunks in a single R Markdown document, and so sometimes it's helpful to name them just to organize your code, but also for more complicated procedures, this can come in handy in R Markdown later. I'm not the best about it. I tend to not name my R chunks, so you can get by without doing that for sure, but it's a good habit to make if you can. Okay, so what we're going to do in our first R chunk here is use the include graphics function from the knitr package to include an image from this URL. Okay, so if you click here, you should be able to open it up and you'll see this is the image which I stored on the website GitHub that we're going to include in our document. So we're going to do that by copying this, pasting it here, and then we're also going to copy the name of the package that we're going to use, the knitr package. So the include graphics is the function that we're going to use, which is from the knitr package. So one way to call R functions is to use the format package name, : function name. And packages, as a reminder, are collections of R functions or R code that we can use. So sometimes to be explicit and make sure you have the right function, because functions can be named the same thing across different packages, using this format is helpful to make sure, hey, we wanted the include graphics function from the knitr package, not a different R package. So we're going to copy this link. And then inside here, it's important, we're going to put this inside double quotes. So it should look green like this. And then we can run this chunk by pressing this green arrow. This is a way to just run this chunk without needing to knit or compile your whole document to check what it'll look like. And R Markdown gives you this little preview down here below the chunk when you run it like that. Sometimes this is squished or a little bit distorted, but it looks better when you knit the overall document. In this case, it actually looks fine. Okay, so this is what the image is going to look like. So Bruno Mars joining us here on our journey to learn R Markdown. Okay, so let's knit that and see how that looks. All right, wow, it's huge. Okay, so we have this image that we read into and included in our document, and then R Markdown shows the code that we'd used to include that image. All right. We can do things like, say, suppress this R code if, for example, we just wanted to include the image, but not show the R code that executed that, using what are called chunk options. So there are many different chunk options which can control the behavior of code chunks. Eval controls whether or not the code is executed in that chunk. Echo controls whether or not the code is shown for that chunk. So by default here, echo was set to true in that it showed this R code. Include controls whether or not code and output produced by the chunk is shown at all. Warning and errors control warning and error messages being shown or not. So these are set to be true or false. And then there's different options for controlling the dimensions of images that are produced or included by the chunk. You can see all default chunk options by copying this code and pasting it into RStudio. So here it shows us eval is set to true by default. So it always evaluates code by default in a chunk when we knit our document. echo is set to true, which we saw, and so on. There's many other options. Okay. So we'll set echo to be false for the uptown chunk now. So we add a comma after the chunk name and we say echo equals false. Now if we knit the document, we'll see the image is still included, but we no longer see the R code above because we set echo equal to false. So why even bother showing R code? Well, sometimes you want to show other people who know R programming, like your future self or other collaborators who know R, what code you used to do that part of the report. Okay. So you can also toggle the include and eval chunk options and see what happens. So for example, if we say eval equals false, and we run this code or compile this document now, you'll see that there's no longer an image included because eval was set to false, so that image was not included, that code was not executed. But if you set it back to equal true and you knit the document, okay, you will see the image is then included. So you can mess around with those chunk options, see what happens. All right, now we'll look at how we can include plots in our document. So let's include a new chunk, let's say, and let's add actually a new section. We'll say including plots. Okay, and then we'll include a new chunk. And let's copy the code exactly here in this grayed out area, which will allow us to reproduce this scatter plot here. Okay. So if we paste this code in here, and then we knit this document, okay, you can see you get these warning messages when loading the tidyverse package. We could try and suppress this by setting message equals false and warning equals false in the chunk options for this, but you don't have to. R is just letting you know that it loaded the tidyverse package, and as a result, some functions from different packages had the same name. So it's letting you know, hey, if you call the filter function, it's going to be used from the dplyr package rather than the stats package. And if you call the lag function, it's going to be used from the dplyr package rather than the stats package. So that's one of the downsides to R, is that functions can have the same name, which can mess up some things because they will behave differently. But that's why it tries to give us a heads up about this warning. But it's actually not a bad thing. This is just being informative. Okay. And here's our scatter plot that we produced. So it matches in the activity document. So that's great. And now we can toggle these figure chunk options and see how that affects our output. So for the fig height option, for example, let's see how that works. So we can say comma fig height equals like 1. And let's see how that looks. We can see it scrunched the plot to be very short. Okay, and we could do the same thing with fig.width. We could say 2. And let's see how that looks. And we made it a little bit small. And notice that it's left justified by default. So we can also say fig.align equals, and I think we do like center. Let's see. Now let's try Let's try center. It might just need the letter C rather than the word center. Nope, okay, center works. So that's how you can change the alignment of the image. Note that this does not work when knitting to Microsoft Word, the figure alignment. It doesn't give an error if you try to do that when knitting to Word. It just won't actually change the alignment of the image. This only works in knitting to HTML, or I believe it also works with knitting to PDF, but not Microsoft Word. There's some finicky things that don't work depending on different formats that you're knitting to, but for the most part, things tend to work just fine. Okay, so that's how we can modify image sizes, figure sizes that we include in our document. We can also use this really powerful aspect of our Markdown called inline R code, or inline code more generally. So we can, for example, have like a sentence that we're typing out, say the 95% confidence interval for the mean is this. And let's say these values depend on a data set that we are working with. Like maybe the data is contained in a CSV file, a comma-separated value file. And we run an analysis in R and we get these numbers for the confidence interval. Maybe our data set is updated, like a couple rows were added to the CSV file, or there were a couple typos that we fixed. You normally would have to retype these numbers in like a Word document yourself after rerunning the analysis. But the nice thing about R Markdown is that you can use this inline R code to automatically update numbers or values based on data that we're working with. Okay. So here, what we're going to do, we're going to add a new section called inline R code. Okay, and we're going to include a chunk of R code. So we're going to insert a new chunk with this code. Okay. Creating XBAR and SE objects so we can enclose those in backticks, since there are objects that we're creating here. And then we will use inline R code at the bottom of the document here to reproduce this sentence saying what the 95% confidence interval is. Okay. So let's see if we can copy this exactly. It might have some issues with the symbols. Let's try it out. No, that looks okay. Okay. So if we copy it like this, what we have going on is that we have inline R code enclosed in backticks. Okay, and then inside it's executing R code. So it's saying here for this block right here, it's saying here, this is going to be R code, and then calculate this value. Okay, which if we see here, if we run this code, and we paste this into the console, we can see the second number should be 4.548, and then the first number should be minus 0.548. So if we knit the document, it looks like this right now, but if we knit the document, these should be numbers instead. Okay. And that's exactly, we can see that happens. So this was produced using inline R code that could be updated if the values of these things changed. It's a very powerful tool to create reproducible analyses in that you can be more efficient about rerunning a report and getting the same numbers every time. Okay. All right. So that's how we used inline R code. And let's see. Oh, the last thing we'll look at is how we can include tables in our document. Okay. So we'll create a new section for tables. So we'll create a new chunk and copy this code exactly to show how we can make tables in R Markdown. So new chunk, paste that code in. All right. And if you just run this, you'll see this creates this table of numbers. So what this did is if you look over in this is called the environment pane, you can see our objects that are created. In this case, we created this object, my table. And my table has 5 rows or observations and 4 variables or columns. You can open it up in R by clicking on it. And we can see this is what it looks like inside R. Sometimes we want to print this whole table in our report. And so we can do that using the flex table package. And specifically the flex table function from the flex table package and the auto fit function from the flex table package, like that. You could run it without this as well. Whenever you load a package with library, you don't have to use this portion of the code when calling a function, but sometimes it's helpful to be more explicit. Again, just in case there's another function called autofit, maybe we'll do that. All right, and then let's knit our document and see how we can reproduce that table. Perfect. Okay, so we have this table in our HTML document. What's nice about Flex Table is that you can knit to PDF, Word, or HTML format, and this table looks pretty much the same. And it's a nice function in that way because not all the table functions work when knitting to all the different formats. Okay, so that's everything for this activity. So when we complete an activity like this, we'll next want to submit our Markdown document that we used to follow along. We'll want to submit this via Blackboard. So how we can do that is we look over here in the Files pane, okay, and we should see this document, this R Markdown document that we saved. So in this case, it's myactivity.rmd. So what we'll do is we'll make sure we knit the document once we're done. Okay, and essentially this produced this HTML file here. Okay, and that shows up over here. That's the HTML file we created. So you can do click view in web browser and it'll open it up. Okay. What we're going to do is download these files as a zip file. And it's important that we do it this way because if you submit an HTML file via Blackboard, it has to be enclosed in a zip file. Otherwise, Blackboard does not accept HTML files. So to get it as a zipped file, we click the check mark next to the R Markdown file we're going to submit and the HTML file. Then we click inside the files pane here. Then we next click, let's see, we click this gear icon. Need to open up my window a little bit more here. We click this gear icon, and then once you have those 2 files checked, we go export and then download. Okay. And it should download a zipped file to your downloads folder, which you can then submit via Blackboard. Okay. So that's how we'll always submit our Markdown documents. We'll submit both the RMD file and the output file that we created. So that's it for this activity on an introduction to R Markdown and RStudio Workbench.